In the UK, the recriminations over the chaotic retreat from Afghanistan continue apace. Now, our attention here was taken in particular by a Daily Mail screamer headline: "The sea was shut." Hero of the piece was Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who had the great misfortune to be holidaying in Crete when Kabul fell. But it's okay, because apparently the sea was shut. To explain, Ian Dunt. Ian Dunt is a columnist with the I newspaper, and yes, he will, I'm sure, explain everything. Ian, welcome.
Hello, thank you very much.
The sea in Crete was closed. What can this mean?
Well, or not, because the Crete authorities have popped up to go, well, we don't really know why he would be saying that. There was nothing going on that day that would mean that the sea was shut. But this is what Dominic Raab, Foreign Secretary, insists. He's insisting it because despite the fact that he knew about the Taliban advance, despite the fact that he knew of the British withdrawal, he decided that it was a good moment for him to go on holiday. This holiday came after him failing to call any foreign minister in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, for the 6 months leading up to this moment. He seems to have been basically completely uninterested in the whole thing. And then, when Kabul fell, he was on the beach. He was seen on the beach by several people sunbathing that day. Then, in a flurry of activity, about 1 a.m. on the Monday afterwards, he suddenly comes back to the UK and insists that really he'd been working in his hotel room, just occasionally popping out, and that it was absurd to pretend that he'd been frolicking on the sea because the sea was somehow
closed. Which, has an air of absurdity, but and look, in this country we have the famous example of the Prime Minister during bushfires, who also went on holidays and told people on radio that, well, he didn't hold a hose, so what good could he be being on deck? I mean, this is a similar case of someone apparently derelict in their responsibilities.
Yeah, except that he really was holding the hose. I mean, we have reports from inside the that he'd been told that if you make a call to these officials in Afghanistan, there's a chance we're going to be able to get people out. There's several interpreters, and there are other figures as well who could be gotten out. And he was told by his officials, you've got to make the call. It's got to come from a senior figure. There's no point delegating this down to a junior minister or a civil servant official. If it comes from the foreign secretary, they're going to pick up the phone. You've got a much better chance of getting those people out. He did not make the call. In fact, what he did was he delegated it to Zach Goldsmith, the junior Foreign Office Minister, and those people did not get out as a result of those calls. So, there were things he could have done using his seniority. He was not in a position to do because he was lying on the beach. Now, there's a sense, that the whole British response has been catastrophic in terms of sort of intelligence coming from the intelligence agencies and security agencies, including what's been going on at the Ministry of Defence, including what's been being done at the Home Office, and including what's been done at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. But the thing is, he does seem to sort of encapsulate the indifference and the ineptitude of the British response. And that idea of him being on the beach just sort of distills all of the various departmental problems into one easily accessible image.
I mean, this in the United States, and I wonder, you'll tell me whether this is true also in the UK, is broadening now into a crisis which, as you say, reflects more broadly on the competence of these regimes, on their sense of power and control. There's a wonderful thing, you may have read it in the New York Times, by Ross Douthat, who talks about our botched withdrawal as the punctuation mark on a general catastrophe, a failure so broad it should demand purges. Is there that sense of almost sort of existential failure in the administration? Is that abroad in Britain as well?
Yeah, there is. And it comes in a double blow because really, Britain has defined itself by the special relationship for so long now with the US. It calls it the special relationship. The Americans never say that. And in fact, every time any British commentator uses it, a part of me shrivels up and dies from embarrassment. But nevertheless, they talk about it incessantly. Now, the manner in which the US executed the withdrawal suggests really that relationship just doesn't exist. There's very little interest from the US. In fact, right now, the US and the UK are engaged in a bitter war of words, where they're essentially sort of trying to trade off blame over the terror attack that hit Kabul airport. So far from any special relationship, it's in fact a deeply corroded and increasingly poisonous one. Then Britain looks towards Europe, where it would naturally look for partners. And what it finds is, the EU has never had a very sort of effective military sort of cooperation It doesn't really have a military dimension to it. But the relationships with countries like France, which does have a very advanced military, is completely dilapidated by the fact that Britain has spent the last 5 to 6 years treating them like sort of foreign enemies and constantly trying to undermine agreements that it has made with them during the Brexit process. So suddenly you think, well, what exactly is the foreign policy of Great Britain? This is a government that talks about global Britain. Well, what does global Britain mean? And they have no answers to that whatsoever. It was a slogan developed to try and neutralize one of the perceived weaknesses of Brexit. It has no substance behind it whatsoever. So it's not only the ineptitude, it's also the lack of any kind of strategic geopolitical foresight, that it has any kind of planning. There just is no plan there. So really the only comparison you would make, I guess, would be Suez. You have to go decades back to find a moment of British humiliation as severe as the one that we're looking at right now.
I'll put it to you that Dominic Raab is no Anthony Eden, however.
No, well, to be honest, he's not even that intellectually impressive. I mean, Eden was a disaster, but you would still hold him in a higher standard than you would Dominic Raab. I mean, this is he's been foreign secretary for a while. He took over from Boris Johnson. I mean, putting Boris Johnson in charge of the Foreign Office was like putting a clown face on top of the nation. I mean, it just suggested we just had no seriousness about our interest in foreign countries at all. Dominic Raab comes in and somehow manages to be even less impressive than his predecessor. He's had nothing to deal with, no crises at all, because of coronavirus. There's basically been, no foreign affairs, nothing to be dealing with. The first one that comes along, he's on the beach. This is the first moment he's been even remotely tested, and this is the extent to which he's performed. Now, he's in front of the Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee in about 45 minutes, where he is expected to get absolutely savaged by the MPs on the committee. Those MPs are predominantly from his own party. I mean, Tory MPs are probably more livid about this because of their sympathy with the military, with an idea of British power, than even Labour MPs. Now, Tom Tugendhat, who's the chair, he's a Tory chair, he's worked in Helmand Province, he served in Afghanistan. He delivered one of the most kind of crushing, emotional speeches to the Commons about the sense of betrayal and horror that he felt and that the armed forces felt watching what was happening in Afghanistan. And the expectation is that he's going to take the Foreign Secretary to task in a very severe manner indeed.
What about domestically? I mean, the obligations of Britain to Afghan people and to those who have now been repatriated and may be seeking refugee status within Britain, where is that at?
Well, we've largely failed there as well. Now, some people have been taken out of Afghanistan. It's under a scheme called Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy, ARAP, which was set up in a very kind of restricted way originally. Originally, they were saying you'd had to have been there over 12 months. It was only after a certain date. They had to be pushed really into making it more expansive to cover the interpreters and sort of civil engineers and others who'd helped Britain and been directly employed. However, they still restricted it to those who were directly employed by Britain. Now, most people who've been working with Britain in various civic projects were not directly employed. They were third-party contractors. Those guys were just completely cut off and left to fend for themselves. Even of those who were directly employed, we know that many of them didn't manage to get out, that we couldn't get them out. At least 300 left behind, but there's some figures that put it up to sort of 9,000 left behind, including all of their dependents. Separately from that, there's a resettlement program which is supposed to take 20,000 people over 5 years for about 5,000 sort of they want this year, and we'll see how it goes. Now that, again, you just think, well, what is it that they're supposed to do? The scheme isn't set up now. The Home Office is extremely reluctant to take in refugees, including, although they don't like to admit it right now, Afghan refugees. So that scheme is help people in 5 years' time. I mean, in 5 years' time, anyone who worked for a feminist organization, any female MP, a female judge, any kind of outspoken sort of human rights activist, those guys are not going to make it for 5 years. So really, the British program for refugees, both in terms of those who helped Britain and those who need protection from the Taliban, is extremely weak, way too little and way too late.
Ian, I had wanted to raise with you the somewhat comparatively trivial issue of Michael Gove's nocturnal activities. Perhaps you'd give us a brief summary.
That's a big jump from horror to comedy. So Michael Gove, an extremely senior figure in the government, Duchy of Lancaster, a key figure in Brexit as well, one of the big political heavyweights, has recently separated from his wife and now is starting to behave in the most extraordinary way. I mean, part of it is we're getting screen grabs coming up of him on dating websites. Another is a nightclub in Scotland, which he entered at around midnight and stayed dancing in what can only be, I mean, to call it a dad dance is to do an injustice to just how traumatic it is to watch it happen, to watch him swizzle around the dance floor, but stayed there in good spirits well into the early hours of the morning. So what we're now demonstrating is some sort of midlife crisis to which I hold no resentment to him. I have to say, I have despised everything about his politics for several years, and he has now done something which I find rather warms my heart towards him, which is that he looks terrible and ill-fitting on a dance floor. It's something that I'm very well used to doing myself. So suddenly we at least have the laughter and matter of watch Michael Gove diminish himself in Scotland's dance floors.
I think we can only say bless. Ian, thank you so much for that splendidly managed transition from the sublime to from the ghastly to the ridiculous. Ian Dunt, a columnist with the I newspaper. Online, of course, you will find him. Seek his name.